Hello again. Welcome back to TerraFirmaCraft HardRock. This is episode 2. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at moving away from our stone tools and getting our first copper ones. Now, there are a few steps to this. We're going to look at getting ourselves some charcoal, making ourselves a charcoal forge, getting more copper, and then making our first copper tool. As you can see, there are a few things I did just in between episodes. Mainly, I went and got some more clay and made some more large vessels just for a little bit more storage. I also gathered some logs. Now, for our first step is charcoal. For us to do that, we need to set some wood on fire, hence why I collected some. So we're going to grab ourselves 2 stacks of charcoal, make ourselves a fire starter, and dig a hole. Now, you can do this in any kind of sealed structure as far as I know, and you can also make this nearly as big as you want. I don't believe there is a size limit, but there may be. So for the time being, we're just going to make a small amount of charcoal just to get us by. Now, in order to do this, you need to place down log piles, which is exactly what I did here. You may notice that you cannot put logs inside any kind of chest or large vessel or anything like that. So you have to store it as log piles. Now, in order to do that, you get yourself some logs in your hand and you simply shift right click. That places down your log pile. You can now right click to just put a log inside. With any other item in your hand, you can open up its inventory, or you can shift right click again to fill it with everything in your hand. So in this case, we're going to put down 2 stacks and then fill in around it. Now, what we need to do here, I'm just going to take the torch out of my hand, is we need to light this on fire. Once it is on fire, we need to very quickly cover it with any kind of block. You know that it has worked if there are some particles coming out, which is what we can see there. Now, that will take a fair amount of time, so we're just going to leave that to go on in the background. Now, when it comes to getting more copper, we have a few different options. We can either go mining for it, but with the stone pick we currently have, that would be very time consuming and somewhat inefficient. So instead, we're going to spend a little bit of time just getting ourselves that pickaxe. Now, we do still have 2 options left to us. We can either scour the map, find some deposits that are marked above ground by the small pieces that we found earlier that will look a little bit like this. They could be called something different, like small malachite or small, I think it's tetrahedrite are the 2 other options for copper, which could be viable, but it may also take us a long time. If we want a slightly more sustainable and easier way of getting copper, we're going to have to make something called a pan, which we do out of clay. Now, as I mentioned before, I did go around and grab a little bit more clay just to make those vessels, and we do have enough for a pan. We only really need 1, so that is what we will do. If we grab ourselves some clay, and we will go ahead and nap it. Now, going off memory, I believe it is that shape. It certainly is. So we would then have to fire this in a pit kiln again. Now, as I mentioned before, it's not really worth firing up a kiln for just 1 item, so we may as well make a few other things. I think we will make, misclick, a jug or 2. Just because these can break and having more water storage is never a bad thing, particularly at the stage we're at where we can't really bulk store it yet. So we'll make a couple more jugs, and we may as well make another small vessel maybe, which I believe, I don't know if I remember how to do a regular vessel. Have a look. Very simple, just the corners. So we will do exactly that. Now, just as we did before, we're then going to need some straw, as well as 8 logs, and then right click our 8 straw in, followed by our 8 logs. We will then set this on fire, like so. That will take 8 minutes. So let's have a think of what else we could do in the meantime. I suppose something that I forgot to mention, I believe, in the last episode, is the importance of large vessels and the smaller ones in the early game. Now, these large and small vessels do actually give a slight buff to food's expiry time. So you can see here that that rye has 8 days until it expires. If we seal that, you can see it's now gone up to 17 days. That is quite a big deal, particularly when you start getting towards colder seasons or if you're living in a place where food is less readily available. This is also true for small vessels. You can just put food inside the inventory of these and it will increase expiry time, which is very nice to know. And now our pit kiln has finished. So if we go ahead and pick up everything, we can now take our pan and head towards some water. Now we could go towards the river, but there are unfortunately some piranhas in there, and I would prefer not to have my feet nibbled while I try and do this. So you're going to need to head towards some water with some gravel in it. Now if you just go ahead and right click with some gravel, you can see that your pan is now full. Now if you are standing in at least 1 block deep of water, you should just be able to hold right click and you will begin panning. And as soon as we are done, you can see we got some copper powder, which is only 5 millibuckets of copper. Now we need 100 ideally, a little bit more would be better, but we can aim for 100. So I am going to continue panning. And that should be enough copper for the time being. As you can see, we did also gather a few other random items, as it is a little bit random as to whether or not you get copper from it. As you can see, we've gathered ourselves some bones, a gold nugget, some flint, and some dolomite rocks. So if we just go ahead, I'll throw it in here for now, and throw all of that stuff in there. Now, I don't know if I remember where I did the charcoal bit. There we go. So the particle effect did stop for this charcoal, which therefore means it is done. Now all you have to do is simply dig it back up. So you can see that we put 32 logs in there and we managed to get ourselves 11 charcoal. So it's not a brilliant exchange rate, if you will, but that is enough, hopefully, for what we need to do. So our next step will be to make our forge. Now to do that, you are going to need a few cobblestone blocks. So if we come and grab ourselves these loose rocks and we put 4 into our crafting table, we can make some cobblestone. Now I believe we need 5 of these, because to make our forge, we need to make a kind of multi-block. Now I like to make mine into the, I'm going to make a shovel, bear with me. I like to make mine into the floor. I think it just looks a little bit nicer. So that is exactly what I'm going to do. So you need to have a cobblestone on the bottom and then 1 on each block surrounding kind of in a circle, if you will. And then you need to take your charcoal and you need to place 7 of it in a pile like so. This is almost a forge. The last thing we need now is our fire starter. Didn't mean to do that. Now, before we do this, we will grab ourselves... no, we won't actually. I lie. So what you would do to turn this into a forge is just get your fire star, shift right click over the charcoal pile, and you should see it turn into a forge. Now, if you right click on this, you can see that it gives you a whole new kind of inventory panel. This will make more sense in a second. But to give you a basic overlay, your fuel goes in these slots here. So you can use logs, I believe, but you're primarily going to be using charcoal. You can then put different items in these slots to heat them up. And that is what we will be doing. But before we do that, we need to make a couple of molds, which is again out of clay. So if we come here, we are going to need a pickaxe mold, which looks like this. More or less what we're going to do is take the copper we just got, put it into one of these vessels, just in the inventory. We're then going to put that in the forge and light it with some charcoal. That will slowly heat up this vessel, and then we'll be able to take our molds, pour the vessel into them, and then extract our various tool heads. Now, I did get a little bit more copper than we needed, enough to the point where if we combine it with this, we will be able to make 2 tools. We're going to make a pickaxe and then probably a saw as well, which will be very useful in the near future. So for now, I will grab our clay, remind myself of the pickaxe mod. I believe it's fairly straightforward. Yeah, and we'll make ourselves a pickaxe mod. May as well just clear out all of this other stuff. We don't need the pan anymore. The next one we're going to do will be a saw mold, which is like so. Don't know if that is correct. It is. And I suppose we could also plan a little bit ahead. Go ahead and do ourselves a couple of ingot molds. Just because, again, if we are lighting the pit kiln, we may as well fill it. Oh, not that. That. Then again, we will gather ourselves some straw, as well as 8 logs. You will be using these pit kilns an awful lot at the beginning, so there will be some waiting around. Now, the reason that I tend on doing the saw as well is because doing things like making chests and crafting tables, for example, not quite so simple in HardRock. If we have a look at the recipe for a chest, so we will be doing an ash chest, but it doesn't really matter. We come to acacia. You'll see that you don't use plank blocks. You use lumber. To get lumber, you need a saw. This is also true for many other items, so a saw will give us access to a few more wooden items that will be very helpful in the near future. Now that our kiln is done, we can begin making our first copper tool. So I've gone ahead and put our copper powder in here. I do just need to grab the rest of this native. How much do we have in here? We have got 160, so really we need 40. As a general rule of thumb, when it comes to doing things with metalwork, it's always good to try and get exactly the amount of metal you plan on using melted. It's a weird sentence to say. That is because when metal is in a vessel, there's no real way to get it out once it's melted apart from pouring it into a mould. To be able to use a mould, you need the full amount of metal. So working with excess is generally not a good idea. We go ahead and pick up these. Don't quite have enough room for them all. we'll just go ahead and throw our jug in there and put our tools in there. So we have our 2 ingot molds, which we are not going to use for the time being. So I will just put those there. And then we have our saw blade and our pickaxe. Now, if we go ahead and grab our charcoal, I did use that time to cut down just a couple more trees and start another charcoal pit, just so we have a little bit more. What we can now do, just double check we have the right amount in here, 160, 40, 200, perfect, is if we come to this inventory and shift right click or shift left click with our charcoal, we can see it fills up that inventory there. We can then put our vessel in this slot here. This should begin to heat it, if my memory serves me. So we will go ahead and light our forge, and that will begin heating up. It will take a little while. Now you may have just noticed that cloud kind of float up to the sky, as well as those ones that are kind of hanging around over there. That is pollution. There's a mod called Pollution of the Realms, I believe, and that adds things like that. There are 3 different kinds. We will experience dust in a few episodes, but the 2 that behave the most similarly are carbon, which you just saw, that kind of grey cloud that floated up, and sulphur. Later in the game we will have to learn to manage those, because if we do not, that can become a little bit of a problem. Now this should not take too long, but it will be rather time consuming. I'm hoping we have enough charcoal. Just going to test as to whether or not I can put logs in here. I can't. Good to know. Like I said, I did start some more charcoal, so hopefully that's done in time, but the charcoal does tend to take, as you can see, 1 minute 48 to be depleted. Copper does have a fairly low melting point, so you can see that we should hopefully have it melted relatively quickly. As far as I understand it, depending on how much is inside of these vessels depends on how long it will take to melt. So you can see here we have quite a bit for a vessel anyway, so this will take a fair amount of time. So, as you can see, we now have molten copper within our vessel. It did take significantly more charcoal than I thought it did, so I did end up having to cut down more trees. But, and we do have to be quick here, if we go ahead and pick this vessel up, right click on it, we can then shift click our molds into it. You can see just there it is filling up. It hits 100, we can do the other one. We had just enough copper to get both the pickaxe and the saw done. Now we can go ahead and take our charcoal out of that, because we do not need that forge to run anymore. I did remember halfway through that there is a much more efficient way to do that, particularly at this stage, because the charcoal forge working with vessels is inefficient. I kind of forgot that. What you can instead do is take your vessel, can't open it, put your copper in as we did before, but you can actually just pick on it. So you'd put your straw and your logs in and light it on fire as you would if you were working with clay. That will still result in the exact same thing. I did remember that after a little while, but out of stubbornness, I continued to run the charcoal forge. So just keep that in mind. But for the time being, we are done with this vessel. So we have now got 2 full molds. If we go ahead and shift right click while looking up, we can take those tool heads out of the molds. You may notice that it has broken the molds, which is rather unfortunate, but at this stage there's not really any way to save those. If we now go ahead and grab ourselves some sticks, we can turn that into a saw and turn that into a pickaxe. So we have now gained ourselves a couple of tools. With that in mind, we are going to set ourselves up a slightly better storage solution than what we have, because lining up loads of vessels is not only inefficient in terms of space, but also it takes a lot of clay. And as far as I know, clay is fairly finite, and at this stage in the game it is definitely time consuming at best to get. So we're going to make some chests. Now to do that, if we come here and we have a look at chests, so again we will just take acacia. We don't have acacia. we need lumber. To get lumber, we need to saw either planks or supports. And for supports, we need to chop them, some logs on a chopping block. So if we go ahead and grab ourselves some logs, we will need to set up a chopping block, which we will do there. So place yourself down a log, get an axe in your hand, and simply right click to strip it, and right click again to make it a chopping block. Take your log types, place them on top of it, and you'll need to right click 3 times, and of course my axe broke. So I have to make another one. Bear with me, one moment. Always happens at the least convenient time, as you can expect. So we will again make ourselves an axe and come back here. And if we right click on it for a 3rd time, you can see we get some supports, just like so. We're going to need a few of them, and you can't ever really have too much in the way of lumber, and support will be very important later on. So I think, I don't know, we'll go for one more, like so. Now if we come to our crafting interface, we can put those supports in there with a saw and gather ourselves some lumber. Before we do a chest, however, you can see that we need that 9x9 grid, which means we are going to need a crafting table, of which we need our spruce planks for, just like in vanilla, but we are going to need to make them out of lumber. So we are simply going to do that, and then place them like so, and we have a crafting table. Now one thing I do like to do is put the saw in there with that, because it gives us a modded one. This is special because it can do things like retain inventories, so you can put things in, walk away, and it will retain them. It also gives you a few different controls. Now, of course, I did not make quite enough planks, so I'm going to have to chop some more lumber. There will be ways to make this both automatic and more efficient a little bit later on. It's not too far away, because this can get rather repetitive, particularly when you have to do an awful lot of it. So we can now come over here, make our lumber, and then make ourselves a couple of chests, which is always very nice. We will place these, alright, we'll go for it here. And we have ourselves a double chest. This, as you can see, is significantly more space efficient than these vessels, which means we can use those vessels for both a backpack and also to store food as a priority. What we are going to do is, as you may notice, the saw as well as other tools will not fit in here, which is rather annoying, but there is a way around this. There is something you can make, if I remember the name, I think it's called a tool rack, yeah, out of 6 lumber. This allows you to store those larger tool items, we might as well make a few while we're at it, in a way that's not chests, which is very helpful because we don't necessarily want to be carrying around a saw with us at all times, and I would prefer not to leave it on the floor. In case you haven't noticed, my memory is poor at the best of times, so if we can possibly negate the risk of me losing things, that would be most ideal. Now this tool rack you do have to place somewhere. For the time being, we'll probably, I don't know, place it next to the crafting table. And then if we just go ahead and right click with our saw, you can see that it is now stored, which is perfect. One final thing I think we're going to do, just before we draw this to an end, is we are just going to very quickly make a barrel. Now we may not necessarily need this yet, but a barrel is very important because it allows us to store liquid or fluid, whatever you may prefer, in many different kinds. You can place it sideways if we use our axe. You can also place it vertically. Now this is important because number one, we can use it to pick up a large amount of water at once. Each one of these I believe can store 10 buckets of any fluid. And We can use it to store things like boiled water. We can also use it to pick up liquid. So what we could do is take this barrel. In fact, I will do it right now. And we will run down to our river just over this hill. Preferably not falling. Hopefully those piranhas do not feel like giving me a quick munch. And we can fill this barrel. What this means is that we don't constantly have to run to that river to get water. But it also means that when it comes to boiling water, we can do it just a little bit quicker. Particularly if we made ourselves a second barrel, we could then transfer the water from this pot into that barrel and have a larger store of boiled water. So we can do it all in one go as opposed to doing it over and over and over again constantly. Barrels are also very useful for processing things. Leather and other things like that. You will need barrels when you are processing it. So they are very important. And for this stage, it is really the only way to store fluid. With all of that in mind, I believe we are going to come to a close. Thank you all for watching. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe, all of those sort of YouTubey things. It does help out an awful lot. As you can see, I am just getting started. So any feedback is welcome. Positive, negative, whatever you feel like. With that in mind, I will see you shortly.